Hey y'all, Tracy here with Just Dig It Farms. Welcome back to part 2 of our little series here on how to create your own potager garden. Today we're going to be talking about some of the design characteristics that you would typically find in a potager garden. There are numerous ways to design potager gardens, from very formal and elaborate to very informal and simple. There's different styles, different layouts, and different sizes. You can have a very large, intricate, detailed potager garden if you have the space for it. If you don't, you can also create a beautiful potager garden in a small space. There's really no set rules to designing and creating your potager garden. I think it just needs to reflect your style, your personality, what you need, and what you want out of the garden. So today's video is not me giving you a set of rules that you need to follow for your garden to be considered a potager garden. I'm just going to share with you my top 10 design elements or characteristics that are typically found in the potager garden design style. But that doesn't mean you have to include all 10 elements for it to be considered a potager garden. This is just to give you a guidelines of where you can start and what you might want to include in your garden. Okay, number 1, your potager garden should be close to your kitchen. Last week in part 1, we talked all about the history of a potager garden. If you haven't seen that, you can go back and watch it now. I'll put a link in the description of this video. But we took a look at the monastery monks and the peasants, and they walked right outside their front door and they were at their potager garden. And we also took a look at Louis XIV at the Palace of Versailles. He demanded that an elaborate potager garden be right outside his chateau so that he could easily go and observe it and actually work in the garden. So if we look back at the history of potager gardens, we see that they were all right outside the door of the home or the kitchen or even Louis XIV's chateau. In permaculture design, we call this Zone 1. Zone 1 is the area that is closest to your home because you're going to be going to this area every single day. You want your potager garden to be as close to your kitchen as possible, but I know not every situation works out perfectly. Maybe your kitchen or your door or your access to get outside to your garden is on the northern exposure of your house. So maybe it doesn't get enough sun in that area to put a garden. And that may be the case for many of you. Just make sure that your potager garden is as close to your kitchen or your home as possible so that it will be convenient and it'll be easy. If you're making a salad for dinner and you need a tomato, if your garden is all the way across the property, you're probably just going to skip the tomato in your salad. But if it's just right outside your door or close to your home, you can go out and harvest everything you need for your salad and it'll be convenient for you. Plus, your potager garden is a space that you're going to want to go to every day to enjoy it, to work it, to harvest from it, to observe. And the closer it is to your home, the more likely you are to spend a lot of time in your potager garden. Right beyond these windows here is my kitchen. We are on my front porch right now, so you can see it is very easy access to get to my garden. This is my front door, which is not far from my kitchen at all. So when you walk out my front door, there is my potager garden. So it's very easy to get to my potager garden from my front door. Number 2. Potager gardens are year-round permanent gardens. It's not your typical garden plot that you would plow up and plant in the spring and then try to wade through the weeds during the summertime to harvest whatever you were able to grow and then mow it down or disc it up and not visit the garden again until the next spring when you plow it back up. That's not the kind of garden we're talking about here. I want you to think about your potager garden as a lifestyle garden. This is a year-round permanent garden. a healthy ecosystem, a living space. You are constantly sowing seeds and planting in this garden. That you're not only planting and growing food and flowers and herbs and fruit, you're also continuously building healthy soil. You're always adding to your soil and building healthy soil. You're sowing cover crops in the wintertime and in the summertime. You can see right back here, all of my potager beds are planted in cover crops right now. There's a lot of rye and turnips and brassicas and chickpeas. I've got all different kinds of cover crops planted in my potager bed right now. It is February right now, and I've started tarping these beds to kill off my cover crops and get my beds ready for spring. So I've already started tarping some of them. And my next step will be to bring in compost and get ready to plant. So all year long, I am working on building healthy soil. I'm sowing cover crops, I'm mulching, I'm adding hay, I'm always adding compost. I'm doing everything that I can all year long to build healthy soil. That's one of the most important things of your garden. Healthy soil equals healthy plants, and healthy plants equals healthy people. The healthier our soil is, the healthier our plants will be, our vegetables, our herbs, our fruits. And the healthier our food is, the healthier our bodies will be. So it all begins with good, healthy soil. And that's something that we're doing all year long. We're working towards building living, healthy soil. This is not a garden where you're just growing annual vegetables like tomatoes and squash and onions and peppers and melons. Now you're growing those things, of course, but you're also growing perennials like asparagus. You're growing fruit like strawberries and blueberries and blackberries and maybe even some fruit trees if you have the space. You're growing medicinal herbs and culinary herbs and flowers and roses and evergreens. This garden should be a diverse mixture of all different kinds of things. And depending on where you are, you could possibly be growing food all year long. But if not, those evergreens and roses and these beautiful cover crops keep the garden interesting and beautiful all year. But this style garden is not really intended for growing mass amounts of produce to sell. It's intended more for your personal use, like your own personal grocery store, your own personal pharmacy, or even flower shop. It's for your own personal use. This is a space that you're going to want to spend a lot of time in throughout the different seasons. Working the garden, observing and learning and growing as the gardener. So this active engagement with the garden makes a potager garden more of a lifestyle than just a seasonal chore. Number 3, a potager garden is as much about beauty as it is function. In fact, I like to say a potager garden is where beauty and function meet. This should be a garden that not only feeds your body, but also feeds your soul. This is a space that is going to be a refuge and a sanctuary for you, a place that you're going to love and enjoy and spend time every single day, working in your garden, harvesting, building soil, planting, learning, observing. You should definitely have sit spots in different areas throughout your garden. Just a place where you can sit and observe and enjoy the beauty, watch the pollinators, watch the beneficial insects, where you can learn a lot from just sitting and looking at your garden. Plus, you also need a place where you can just sit and rest for a few minutes. I have an old bench sitting right here under my beautiful rose arbor where I can see a lot of the potager garden. But I also have sit spots in different areas throughout the garden so that I can observe or rest in the different areas. your garden will actually become a beautiful habitat for many beneficial insects and pollinators all throughout your garden. And birds. You want to invite the birds to your garden. And I know that this sounds a little contradictory, especially if you have berries or fruits and different things that you don't want the birds to eat. But we really want to invite those birds to the garden because they take care of a lot of pest pressure in your garden. And it's just beautiful to see it and watch the birds. I can see my potager garden out my kitchen windows, and I love to watch all of the different beautiful birds out in my garden. And like we've already discussed, the potager garden is going to be a beautiful, diverse mixture of so many different things. Flowers and herbs and beautiful fruits and vegetables and all different kinds of things in your garden. So it's going to be a lovely, beautiful space that you're going to want to spend a lot of time in. My second college degree is in interior design, and I worked in that field for quite a few years, mostly on the commercial end. We did hotels and motels and offices and conference rooms and things like that. Later, after I discovered my love and passion for gardening, I went back and got a degree in landscape and garden design. So in having that interior design background, I always look at designing garden spaces as in creating rooms. So number 4, every potager garden should have a welcoming entrance. Just like the front door of your home is a welcoming entrance into your home, you should have a welcoming entrance into your potager garden that says, come on in. This is a magical, beautiful space. The entrance into your potager garden can be something very informal and very simple. It could be as simple as a couple of posts with an old wooden gate on it. It could be as simple as 2 4x4 posts with a cattle panel arch, as you see right here, that has roses growing on it. You could create an entrance just using plants. You could put a couple of evergreens in big pretty containers and grow some plants around the bottom of it and just have your pathways going between the containers, and people would know that that was an entrance into your garden. Or your entrance could be something very elaborate. It could be stone columns and iron gates and roses dripping off the gates. It really doesn't matter what materials you use or how you create your entrance. It just needs to be very clear that this is the entrance into your garden and you're saying, welcome, come on in. Number 5, every potager garden needs some type of walls or enclosure. Just like the walls in your home creates different spaces within the home, walls in your garden creates different spaces within your garden or makes it feel like different rooms within your garden. Walls also create privacy, making the garden feel like it is a space of its own, like you're creating a private, intimate space for you to refuge to. Another good thing about walls around your garden is it helps to keep pests, unwanted wildlife in your garden like deer, or here on our property we have problems with deer and wild hogs. So a fence around our garden is very important to keep those pesky, unwanted wildlife out of the garden. Another beautiful thing about creating these walls around your garden or within your garden is it creates a vertical growing space for you. Now you need vertical growing space in your garden to keep it interesting, to keep your eye moving, and to keep your garden very interesting. We'll talk about that in a minute. But you also need this vertical growing space for many of the vegetables and fruits and some of the herbs that you're going to want to grow, like cucumbers and tomatoes and pole beans and peas and gourds and butterfly pea and runner beans. And on the herbs, you need a vertical growing space for passion flower and hops. There's all different kinds of things that you're going to want to grow in your garden that is going to require a trellis for you to be able to grow them properly. So the walls around your garden or within your garden are perfect for vertical growing. Now these walls can be created from man-made materials like wooden fences or 4x4 posts and cattle panels like we did here around my garden, or stone or brick or different materials like that you can create these walls. But they can also just be living walls. You can create beautiful living walls with evergreens like tea olives or cryptomerias or arborvitaes. They're so beautiful. I love the look of living walls created with those evergreens. It's so English and it's so beautiful. And keep this in mind, you don't have to create tall walls like this within your garden. You can just create little walls, like little 2 or 3 feet walls if you don't want to obstruct a view, but you want the space to feel like a room of its own. You can create this illusion with boxwood hedges or little evergreens, hollies, little soft touch hollies. You can even use germanders, which is an herb, a little evergreen herb, and you can create these little walls within your garden that make it feel like it's a space of its own, but it's not a tall wall obstructing that view. One of my favorite ways to create walls around a garden is with espaliered fruit trees. Espalier is an art form. So you build these trellises and you train your fruit in a very beautiful art form along wires down the trellises, and it will create a wall, but it's also a wonderful way to grow fruit trees. If you have a very small gardening space but you want to grow fruit, this is a wonderful way to do it because it takes up linear space, but it doesn't take up as much space depth or width. You probably could go 3 feet, 4 feet is as wide as it'll go. So this is a wonderful way to grow fruit trees if you have a smaller space to grow in. And it also creates beautiful walls around the garden. Number 6, every potager garden should have clear pathways. Just like the hallways in your home help you to move from one room to the next, the pathways in your garden help you move throughout your garden and within your garden beds. You should have comfortable and functional pathways that help you move throughout your garden. But you also need to remember to have pathways within your garden beds as well so that you can get in there and harvest all of the things that you've grown without stepping on the plants. I'm very guilty of this one. I try to cram in as much as I can possibly get in my bed, and then I have a hard time getting to it and harvesting it. Also, think about how you're going to get your materials to your beds, like your mulch or your compost. Think about the type of equipment that you're going to need to be able to move throughout those pathways to get them to your bed. Are you just going to use a wheelbarrow? Well, how much space does a wheelbarrow take up? Are you going to have grass pathways and you're going to need to mow those pathways? Well, what is the width of the mowing deck? Or what about a tractor? Are you wanting to use a tractor to get materials to your garden? You got to think about the equipment and how much space it takes up and how you're going to be able to get those materials to your garden beds. And don't forget about those turns that a mower or a wheelbarrow needs to make along that pathway. When you're turning to go around, don't forget about leaving enough space to make that wide turn. I'm very guilty of this. There's a lot of places in this garden, when you make the turn, you always hit my bed borders, and I always have to go back and put them back in place. So keep these things in mind when you're creating your pathways. Your pathways can be created with many different materials. You could just have grass pathways like I do here in my garden. Or you could have mulch pathways and then use something different like hay or something in your beds. You could use pea gravel, you could use stones, you could use brick, you could use flagstones and pea gravel and put like the pea gravel in between the flagstones. Or you could use flagstones and plant creepers in between it. Now, I have tried probably my whole gardening career or life to grow beautiful little creeping toms in between flag pathways or bricks. It never works. They never do exactly as beautifully as it shows in Pinterest or the garden magazines. I've tried it and I'll probably keep trying it. it never works out as beautiful as it does in the magazines. But you could definitely give that a try too. Hey y'all, I wanted to just remind you to go over to our website, justdigitfarms.com. A little box will pop up asking you to subscribe to our newsletter. Go ahead and do that, and on the 1st of every month you will receive an email that will be our monthly garden newsletter. I'm so excited about this because I believe it is going to be very helpful for you as a gardener to know what to do in your garden each month. This is totally free. It don't cost you anything. All you have to do is just subscribe for our newsletter and you will receive it each month. Number 7. Potager gardens usually have defined garden beds and borders around those beds. Traditional potager gardens were 4 squares in a grid-like pattern that had pathways going between each one of them with something as a center focal point in the middle of them. And in the real formal ones, you would typically find little boxwoods going around the whole square garden beds to create little walls or little bed borders around each garden bed. Potager gardens typically have geometrical shaped beds, circles, squares, triangles, rectangles. I think it's really beautiful to do a mixture of two or three of these different shapes and repeat them all throughout your garden. I also like to include raised beds within the potager garden as well. Now you can do a whole garden just out of raised beds if you want to. My garden is a mixture. I have a lot of big rectangle sized beds. I have 9 rectangle sized beds. They are 15 by 40 foot, each one of them. I have a couple of small rectangle beds that's like 3 feet wide and maybe 25 feet long. I have raised beds, I have circle beds, I have a mixture of all of these different kind of bed sizes and shapes within my potager garden. As far as bed borders, I really recommend that you put some kind of border around each one of your garden beds. Otherwise, whatever your pathway is, especially if it's grass, it's going to creep into your garden bed. You're going to have a hard time managing that. Or, you know, your different mulches or different materials will go over into your pathway. It's just always better to have borders around each bed. And you can use rock, you can use railroad ties, you can use landscape timbers, you can use wood, you can use brick, stone, stacked stone. You can buy those little stones at Lowe's or Home Depot. There's all different kinds of things you can use to create these borders. Now you could use metal edging around your border and just have a different material for your pathway and a different material for your bed, but that metal edging will help keep the materials separated. That's a good option if you just like that real clean look with no bed borders. Or if you have raised beds, this is actually your bed and your bed border all in one. Number 8, add structure to your garden. This is the bones of the garden. If you have good structural elements within your garden, then the garden will be beautiful even when nothing's blooming. When I'm talking about structure in the garden, it can be things like the rock that you use as borders around your garden beds. It could be the brick that's in your pathway. It could be the walls that you've created within your garden, the fence around your garden. It could simply be those materials that you use in the garden that give structure to your garden. That's going to be an element that is in your garden even during the winter time when nothing's growing. It's the bones of the garden. But structure can also be focal points that's within your garden. So focal points can actually move you through the garden. You can direct somebody where you want them to go in the garden through a focal point. Just like we're standing right here in the garden, and when you're looking back that way, you see that arbor back there. I don't know if you can see it or not, but there's an arbor right there. And it kind of is telling you to move this way through the garden. So you can definitely use a focal point to move people through the garden. Focal points are very interesting elements that are in your garden. It could be the arbors, it could be pergolas, moon gates, trellises, obelisks, water features like fountains or bird baths. It could be a planted container that has a big beautiful specimen tree in it. There's all different kinds of things that you can use as focal points in your garden. But be real careful here. Don't use too many focal points in your garden, because then it just becomes junk and your eyes get confused and they don't know what to focus on. Your eyes don't know what to land on and look at. And you want focal points to be something that says is a statement, and it says, hey, look at me, I'm important. So be very careful with that. Don't use too many focal points in the garden. The vertical elements in your garden is also structure of your garden. So that would be this rose arbor here. That would be the fence that we were looking at a minute ago going around the garden. It would be different kinds of trellises that you're growing your plants on. This is a beautiful piece in the garden. It's structure to the garden, it's vertical growing space, and it's just really pretty. I think it's an art form in the garden. So here's a recap. Structure in your garden can actually be the materials that you're using in your garden, such as your brick or your stones or your wooden borders. Those are structures in the garden. They also can be the vertical element that you're using in the garden. The trellises, the fences, the arbors, the archways, all of these things are structure in your garden. And focal points, things like your bird baths, your fountains, your statues, art pieces. This is a focal point. You really need structural elements in your garden, because this is what's going to make your garden interesting, even during the winter time when it's bare and nothing is blooming or growing out here. Number 9, add history, art, and lighting to your garden. Now these are things that are kind of like accessories to your garden. Once you get your garden built and established, these are the fun elements that you want to bring in that really brings that garden alive and adds character and personality to the garden. Let's talk about history first. Use things in your garden that mean something, that tell a story, that has history behind it. So for example, in my garden here, you can see this old container right here, this beautiful concrete pot. This was Jean's grandmother's, Grandmother Britnell. Very, very special lady whom we all loved and adored. She was just an angel sent from heaven, and she was special to everybody, to her whole family. We all loved and adored her. This was her container. This was her pot. So I have it at the entrance into my garden. Every time I walk in this garden and I look at this pot or I plant this pot, I think about Grandmother Britnell. Also, these iron gates, that is my entrance into my garden. These were given to me by Jean's mom and dad, and they're very, very special gates. She had them at her old house, and she had like a little secret garden. It wasn't a big garden, but she had a little secret garden, and she had roses climbing on this. And in this little garden, she had a statue that we had given her of an angel, and she had a little memory garden right there for her son, Jean's brother, that died at a very young age with cancer. And this was just their little memory garden of Bill, their son. And when she gave me these gates, I mean, they're just so, so special to me. And every time I look at these gates or enter these gates, I think about how blessed I am to have such wonderful mother and father-in-law. And I think about, you know, Bill, Jean's brother. He was a different guy, and he always made us laugh, and he was a character. And I think about him every time I look at these gates. So this is history. This is memories. These are very, very important pieces to me. Incorporate plants all throughout your garden that have been shared with you, or that were cuttings from your grandmothers or your great-grandmothers, or they were shared plants by dear friends or family members. Also, right here at my entrance, you can see, I don't know if you can really see it or not. Remember, it's February and everything is just getting ready to burst out and bloom and be beautiful. But this is a climbing rose. This is Clotilde Serpere, very, very beautiful antique rose. And my sweet friend Lacey, that I worked with at Petals from the Past, she gave me these two climbing roses, and I put them by the entrance into my garden. Every time I look at these roses and they bloom or their fragrance fill the air, I think about my friend Lacey and her 2 children that I just love. I adore them. I watched them grow up. And that's who I think of when I look at those. I also have a rose that Jason from Cog Hill gave me. He took cuttings off of an old rose on the side of a road, and he gave me a cutting from that. So I have a Cog Hill rose out here. I've got some Lenten roses that my friend Connie gave me. I've got some salvia that my friend Holly gave me. I mean, I've got all kinds of different plants that was shared with me or given to me. And I think about that person when I connect with that plant. So that is a very cool thing and a cool way to add history and memories to your garden. Also, grow heirlooms and herbs and perennials that have stories behind them. A lot of your heirlooms and the herbs, they all have great history behind them, where they came from, what they were used for. So put those in your garden. Definitely include those in your garden. Learn about them, learn about the history of that plant, and then when you have friends over and you take them for a tour through your garden, you can share the history or the story behind that plant and impress them. I bet you will impress them. Now let's talk about art. Add art to the garden tastefully. Be very careful with this. Just like we talked about focal points, be very careful not to add too many things to your garden where it's just confusing and cluttered and scattered. That's not the point. You want to add things to your garden that are beautiful and lovely and that mean something to you. So when I say adding art to your garden, that could be the focal point, like statues or water fountains or bird baths, or even that trellis I showed you a minute ago. That is very much a piece of art in the garden. But you also could add, maybe if you had a fence around your garden, you could add some beautiful wall art or a wall fountain or something like that on the fence as a focal point, maybe by a seating area or something like that. Also, the use of color is very much an art in the garden. Think about color combinations when you're planting. Maybe do a mixture of purple kales and green kales, or maybe even purple cabbages and the green cabbages. That purple and that green planted together is a beautiful, beautiful contrast. So think about those contrasts, planting things together that contrast or that complement each other. Think about adding the different textures and forms in the garden. This is art in your garden. You can actually use color to move you through the garden. You can put pockets, like this is the entrance into my garden, the main pathway into my garden. I could do a pocket of purple here, purple here. I could do another pocket of purple back there, and that would lead you to the garden because it's repetition and it moves you through the garden, your eyes following that color. So color is a very powerful element to use in the garden, and it is art in your garden. And lighting. Lighting just makes a very magical space. So on the front of my garden here, I have these little Edison string lights going all down my garden. At night, it is just beautiful. There's more lighting that I want to add to this garden. I want to add pathway lighting to help lead you down the paths. You can do uplighting to light some of those focal points. You know, you put a light at the base of it, shine it toward the focal point, makes it very important then. There's all different kinds of ways you can incorporate lighting into your garden. What about a chandelier with candles on it over a seating area? Lighting is just like the icing on the cake. Number 10, include your utilitarian spaces within your garden, or at least as close to your garden as you can. I think this just makes good sense. If all of your garden tools are way out in the barn and you have to walk a long way to get them, that is just not efficient. If you're like me, you won't go put your tools up and you'll just leave your tools laying out in your garden somewhere, and that's not very good either because you'll be replacing tools all the time. So I think it just makes sense to keep your spaces that houses your tools or your materials as close to you, as close to your garden as you can, just to make it efficient for you, so you don't have to make as many steps. These would be the areas like your garden shed, your greenhouse, your compost area, your tool shed, all of these spaces and buildings and areas that you need to work your garden properly. You want to keep those close to your garden. Now you can make them really cute. You could paint them a pretty color. If you want to go for color, I like my white garden shed. You could plant things to grow up the sides of your building. You could hang art on your building and just incorporate all of that into your garden. You can make beds around these buildings and create more growing space. I think it just makes really good sense to have these utilitarian spaces as close to your garden as you can. There you have my top 10 elements or characteristics that I think clearly define a potager garden, and I hope this has given you some inspiration and some ideas for you to get those wheels turning and start thinking about the ones that you want to incorporate to create your potager garden and how you're going to design it and create it. And y'all stay tuned, because next week I'm going to give you some tips and some step-by-step guidelines of how you can design and create your own potager garden. Thank y'all so much for hanging out with me today. God bless you, and I'll see you next week.